Hi, my name is Nina Teicholz. I am an author and a journalist and the head of a nonprofit called the Nutrition Coalition, and I am going to talk today about vegetable oils. What is their history? Where do they come from? Why do we eat them? Why do we think they're good for health? And so I'm going to start this lecture like any other that I normally do, which is with my disclosures, which is that I do still receive royalties from a 2014 book I wrote called The Big Fat Surprise. There's a lot in this book about vegetable oils in case you want to read more about them. But I receive no money and never have from any kind of industry. I don't receive it for my research, for my writing, for anything that I do other than some speaking. And I think it's important for people who talk about food to also disclose their dietary preferences because they have such a strong influence on how we believe, what we think about diet. So I want to say that I used to not eat red meat or butter for more than 25 years. I stayed away from animal foods, and I did eat vegetable oils. But after doing a great deal of research and publishing my book, I no longer follow that diet. So what are we talking about when we talk about vegetable oils? Really, this is the list of them. Corn, cottonseed, soybean is the principal one in the United States, safflower, peanut, canola oil. They're really not vegetable oils. They're more properly called seed or bean oils because that's what the oil is pressed from. But I guess in terms of the kind of the palatability of how something sounds, they've been called vegetable oils or more recently plant oils, and I guess that's considered a more appealing term by those who market them. But it's important to say at the outset that vegetable oils were not consumed by humans for the vast majority of our history. These are the fats that I'm showing here that we ate, that we ate and we cooked with, which is tallow which comes from cows, suet, which comes from sheep, lard, which comes from pigs, and of course butter, which comes from milk. The predominant fats that were cooked and eaten in the West, in Western nations until the 20th century, were lard and butter. And it is fair to say that in the early 20th century, lard was still considered something that people would eat. It's even seen as glamorous here, but I'm sure this is now really unimaginable to us that lard could be so glamorous or even something remotely acceptable. So times have certainly changed. Oil was not originally a foodstuff. Even olive oil was not originally invented for eating. It was used as a lubricant for the body or for making cosmetics in those regions of the world that raised olives. But in the West, oils were principally used to lubricate machinery. And that was extremely important in the Industrial Revolution because those oils had come from whales, but when whales were hunted to extinction or near extinction, there was a great need for an alternative source of oil, and that came from cotton seeds. Cotton seed oil was a byproduct of the cotton that was being grown in the southern part of the United States, and so that oil was then used predominantly to lubricate machinery. It was not used as something that humans consumed. That changed when Procter & Gamble, which was soap and candle makers, they looked at oil and they managed to harden it, which is a process that we'll talk about in a little bit. And they made a product that they called Crisco. In 1911, that was the first time that they marketed Crisco. That was the first time that a vegetable oil as such came formally into the American food supply. It's important to say that was the first formal introduction because there had informally been butter adulterated with oils that had been sold, but this was the first product that was made from vegetable oils, and it was sold very aggressively by Procter & Gamble. It's a company that still exists. I'll just read to you a little bit from their marketing materials, which were so extraordinary. They really played on this feeling that immigrant American housewives had, that they wanted to be part of the new. They wanted to be American, and they wanted to integrate into America, and therefore they did not want to hang on to the traditions of their grandmothers. So here's just some of the marketing materials. While Crisco may be, quote, a shock to the older generation born in an age less progressive than our own, unquote, A modern woman is glad to give up butter and lard, just as her, quote, grandmother was happy to forego the fatiguing spinning wheel, unquote. There was also a cookbook entirely made up of Crisco recipes, and it claimed that Crisco was easier to digest than butter or lard, and that it was produced in sparkling bright rooms where white enamel covers metal surfaces. And that was meant to draw a distinction between Crisco and sort of the really unseemly conditions of the slaughterhouse that had been brought to light in, some reporting and books about the conditions in the slaughterhouses. Crisco was not like that. Produced in laboratories, like scientific laboratories. Also, Crisco did not smoke up the house when used in frying. Kitchen odors are out of the place in the parlor, said the Crisco recipe book. So this is how they came into the food supply, and they were fairly rapidly adopted. This is some pictures of the marketing of Crisco and how delicious it was. It was digestible, economical. It was cheaper than butter. And the other form of hardened vegetable oils was margarine, and that was a direct competitor to butter because it was made in many states to be yellow, or if it wasn't allowed to be yellow because the dairy industry had prevented margarine from competing with it, and so it had to be sold as a white block, then they would sell it with like a little yellow pill, sort of a pill that you could break up and you would knead it all together so it would look like butter. It was cheaper, and for that reason, there were housewives all over the country because there were many, many laws against the margarine competing with butter. So there were housewives across America that were fighting to get their access to margarine. It's really an extraordinary chapter in American history. I'm going to pause for a second and just give you a little chemistry lesson in fatty acids, which is important to understand one of the fundamental things about vegetable oils, why they're hard or why they're in an oil form. You can see this vegetable oil molecule, which is on the bottom here, and you can see that it wiggles a lot. It's not a straight molecule, and that's because of those double bonds, which cause like a little crick in the chain there. So when you have molecules like that are squiggly, they don't stack up neatly on top of each other, and so they can't hold together. That's why they're an oil and not a solid. Compared to saturated fatty acids, which have no double bonds, as you can see, it's a straight chain. One fatty acid on top of the other is able to hold together without much air between it, so it makes a solid, something like butter or lard, which is solid at room temperature. So this is an important fact to know about fatty acids because one of the problems with the oils was that they were oils. Well, how did they harden them to make Crisco and margarine? And this they discovered that they were able to do this through a process called hydrogenation. So this happens in a plant, and they're able to take that squiggly molecule, which is represented here. This is actually the fatty acid in olive oil, so there's only one double bond there. But they're able to straighten it. So that then the molecules can sit on top of each other and be hardened. They can be a hard substance, a solid. And the process of hydrogenation is very complicated. It involves heat, intense heat. It involves a metal catalyst that is used. Often hexane is the solvent. It takes, basically what comes out is not oil, but it's sort of like a gray sludge that then has to be deodorized and winterized and bleached. And then some of the nutrition that is lost has to be added in as supplements, and then it needs artificial coloring. So it's quite a long process, and it's by no means a natural product at all. But at the end of it, what you get is not an oil, but a solid, and you can alter this process of hydrogenation and tinker it such that you can have a very soft solid, so something like a cupcake frosting, or you can have a harder solid, something like the coating on a chocolate. So it was very malleable in terms of how much hydrogenation you could apply to oil, and you could have a wide range of products that came out, and this made it really perfect for food processing. Ironically, hydrogenation also allowed the introduction of cooking oils into Americans' kitchens because light hydrogenation, a very light amount of hydrogenation, stabilized these oils enough so that they didn't go rancid quickly, because that was the basic problem with oils, is that they went rancid. They would smell bad, they would look bad, but a very light touch hydrogenation allowed them to be sold as oils. And that is when we started to cook with them. Restaurants started to cook with them. These are some of the early ones that came into the food supply. This is maybe the 1940s we're looking at. And then what happened that changed all of history really was this, which is that the American Heart Association got behind vegetable oils with this statement in 1961, which said, in order to prevent heart disease, our best advice to you is to replace saturated fats, such as those in butter, in red meat, in dairy, replace them with polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Have low fat, have lean meat, and have margarine or oils instead of butter for cooking. This was an enormously influential recommendation because up to that point, Americans really had had no advice in how to eat to avoid heart disease. And we're going to see here why heart disease was so important to Americans. But first, I want to explain why the American Heart Association might have been so eager to recommend polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And one of those reasons that I discovered was that it had a very close relationship with Procter & Gamble, which went back to 1948. Previously, before 1948, the American Heart Association had been a very kind of tiny little association of cardiologists. Heart disease was rare during that time. And so this was a small one-office association of cardiologists who there were just not many cardiologists at the time because heart disease had been relatively rare. Then Procter & Gamble came along, and in 1948, they made the American Heart Association the designee of this radio contest that was Jack Benny's Truth or Consequences, a very big radio show at the time. And these quotes here are actually from the American Heart Association's official own history book, which they said they were made rich by being the designee of this contest, and there were millions poured into their coffers, and overnight they became sort of a powerhouse and opened chapters all over the country, and they have been and remain the largest nonprofit in the United States. So why was the American Heart Association's recommendations so very important to Americans? Well, as you see here, the fear of heart disease was just a kind of panic in America. And the sort of focal point of this was the heart attack that President Eisenhower had in 1955, where he was out of the Oval Office for 10 entire days and then in convalescence. And this terrified Americans because they really had no idea about what caused heart disease. And heart disease had risen from being almost non-existent in the early 1900s, which you can see from this graph, to becoming an epidemic. It was the number one killer of men, 1955, with that red arrow there is Eisenhower's heart attack. So the nation was really focused intensely on this problem. It was the headline of every day's news, what was causing heart disease? And there were a number of explanations. One of them was that it was a type A personality. People would run around screaming at everybody else, and then all of a sudden they would drop dead of a heart attack. Another explanation that was debated among scientific journals was that it was vitamin deficiency of some kind. People were not getting enough of the essential nutrients and vitamins that they need. The third explanation was that it might be auto-exhaust. According to all the rising fumes from the growing number of automobiles on American roads. All these were legitimate hypotheses that were debated amongst scientists, but the one that really won out was this one by Ansel Keys that ended up being adopted by the American Heart Association. Ansel Keys was a physiologist from the University of Minnesota, and his hypothesis, called the diet heart hypothesis, was that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol were what caused heart disease. They did that by slowly accumulating in the arteries, principally as cholesterol plaques, and then they would sort of clog them up like hot oil down a cold stove pipe, and then eventually just choke off your arteries and cause a heart attack. This hypothesis meant in practice that you had to cut down the foods that contain saturated fats, as we talked about, and then shift over to have polyunsaturated vegetable oils instead. It was an extremely influential hypothesis. Ansel Keys himself was extremely influential. He was on the cover of Time magazine in the same year, 1961, that the American Heart Association recommendation came out. And if you think about it, at the time, it was a little crazy to think that vegetable oils cause heart disease because, as you can see in these charts, it was precisely saturated fats in butter, lard, and tallow that were dropping precipitously already in the American diet. Because remember, margarine and Crisco were cheaper, vegetable oils were quite cheap, and it was the rise of unsaturated vegetable oils that perfectly coincided with the rise in heart attacks. But that was somehow scientists of the time didn't see this contradictory information, or if they did, they ignored it. But already in the 1960s, you saw that there was an elevation of vegetable oils to a kind of medical product. I mean, it gave such an enormous boost to these oils because now not only were they cheaper, they might have been sold as tastier or cleaner, but they were also sold and marketed as a product that you could reliably use to lower your risk of heart disease. Here's an ad by Wesson. This was a book that was by a Dr. Jeremiah Stamler, who closely, for his whole life, or most of his life, associated with the American Heart Association, that was sponsored by companies that made vegetable oils, and it was distributed free to thousands of doctors all over the United States, and urging them and encouraging them to switch to polyunsaturated vegetable oils instead of saturated fats, and to tell their patients that. Here are more ads that are marketing vegetable oils as medical products. Take this ad to your doctor. Even your child should worry about this. It's never too early to start with vegetable oils and margarine in order to prevent heart attacks. At the time that the American Heart Association came out with its advice, there had been no real test, or what we call a clinical trial. A randomized controlled clinical trial had never been done to actually look to see if polyunsaturated fats could reduce heart attacks and deaths in humans. And so what happened after 1961 is that in the 1960s and 70s, there were large clinical trials all over the world by governments in Australia, Norway, Finland, and the US and England, and they all undertook to test this hypothesis of whether replacing saturated fats with unsaturated, polyunsaturated vegetable oils would actually reduce heart attacks. So there's been a summary. There's been many, many summaries of these clinical trials now. But these trials were on altogether some 75,000 men and women, or others put the number at 67,000. But a huge number of people were tested over many, many years in trials that lasted many years. These are considered very long-term clinical trials. And what were the results? The cumulative results of all these trials, but that they could find no effect of saturated fats on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality, which means death from anything. Because it's no good if you save your spared death from a heart attack, but then you die of something else instead. What they found was that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats made no difference. And in most of the clinical trials, they also found that saturated fats had no effect on heart disease, things like heart attacks, strokes, angina, but other signs of heart disease other than, before death. So in nearly a dozen of these studies, one of the results that goes little mentioned is the fact that this is from one of the studies called the LA Veteran Study, which that the people who took the polyunsaturated fats or had diets high in polyunsaturated fats, they died at much higher rates from cancer. And this was a consistent finding that was found in a number of these clinical trials, to the point that the National Institutes of Health, which was actively then researching saturated fats and unsaturated fats and recommended, or was very close to the American Heart Association and its recommendation, they had a series of workshops in the early 1980s to see why were people dying of higher rates from cancer. And they really couldn't figure it out. There were a number of explanations, but ultimately they just decided that they did not want to pursue this line of thinking, pursue this further, because they did not want to contradict the more urgent and common, by then common sense, public health message that everybody needed to lower their cholesterol, which you would do by eating vegetable oils, not saturated fats. Other possible health effects that came about and were discovered quite early on from eating diets higher in vegetable oils were gallstones. They occurred 2 times higher than the group eating more saturated fats in the LA Veterans trial. And they were also found that if you lowered your cholesterol through drugs, you were more likely to get gallstones. So this could be due to the oils, or it could be due to their cholesterol lowering effects. Originally it was their ability to lower total cholesterol, and then when scientists had the capacity to measure both LDL and HDL cholesterol, it was the capacity for vegetable oils to lower your LDL, your low density lipoprotein cholesterol. And that was considered what was beneficial about them. So remember, there were drugs that did that, and there was diet that did that. Both had the effect of lowering your LDL. But you would end up in trials of both diet and drugs having higher rates of gallstones, also higher rates of stroke. One of the consistent findings in really every study on saturated fats is that a higher consumption of saturated fats is associated with a much lower rate of strokes. And conversely, the more polyunsaturated fats you eat, the higher rate of strokes. There was also some indication that corn oil was inducing cirrhosis of the liver. There were certainly concerns going back to the 1980s about the health effects of polyunsaturated fats, or the effect of using them in place of saturated fats, but these were really ignored. And so we see the result was that soybean oil consumption, especially, but these oils in general, really rose in consumption in America. This is the 20th century we're looking at, really more than any other foodstuff. There's no food item that grew more in terms of U.S. consumption than polyunsaturated vegetable oils, with soybean leading the way. It now represents some 30% of all of the calories that we eat, from zero when we started out in 1900. What are the reasons for this dramatic increase? Well, the one that we saw was the American Heart Association. Of course, it gave it a huge push. And then the U.S. government got on board with the dietary guidelines for Americans. That was launched in 1980. And this was the whole federal government getting behind this recommendation to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol. Maybe not explicitly in this dietary guidelines. This is the very first one, but subsequently they would say replace saturated fats with vegetable oils. Here again is the food pyramid. Maybe some of you, this helps you recognize the U.S. dietary guidelines, which is otherwise a vague government policy. But most people know the food pyramid, or as it is now, My Plate. It consistently said reduce saturated fats and fats generally. And this is the dietary guidelines today. They're issued every 5 years. So this is the most recent one, which came out in 2020. And you can see they're actively mapping out or modeling out the amount of oil you should be consuming. So they do it in grams, unhelpfully for Americans who don't think in grams. But this is a lot of oil, depending on, whether or not you're following the guidelines, or how many calories you're eating a day. You can get up to 10 teaspoons of oil a day. And somewhere in the guidelines, but I couldn't pull it out, they do specifically say soybean oil as the oil that they most recommend, but they do recommend other oils as well. And it's important to know that these dietary guidelines are just extremely influential. If this may seem like something most of us can ignore, but if you're in a school, school lunches, programs for the elderly, feeding programs for women and infant children, hospital guidelines. These recommendations are consumed by many, many people who really don't have a choice. They're sort of captive audiences to these recommendations. And they're also dispensed by all doctors, nutritionists, dietitians, nurses. They will all dispense the dietary guidelines because they're considered the gold standard. This is just the chart that I actually made to show the influence of the guidelines. You can see the USDA feeding programs, school lunches, going down through the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Diabetes Association, all these groups follow the guidelines. And they say it, we follow the guidelines. The military follows the guidelines. We have an obesity problem in the military equal to the one that we have in the nation as a whole. And they are going through rigorous physical training, but they still have an obesity problem. And the whole U.S. food supply, when you flip over the facts panel and look at a food item and all of that, the amounts of things that you're supposed to have, and, this is 20% of your daily recommended allowance, well, that comes from the U.S. dietary guidelines. So everything that we think about food really comes from this policy. And this is the policy that tells us to eat vegetable oils. Also, the other reason that vegetable oils came surging into the U.S., into the economy and into our consumption of them is that they really are the backbone of the food industry. I mean, as I described, they're hugely malleable. You can use them to just make any kind of product that you want, any kind of coating, anything, any kind of baked product. So really, most of the center aisles in the supermarkets are some form of cereal or wheat and vegetable oils, and maybe sugar is really, and salt is what most of them are made of. If you think of like cookies, crackers, chips, cereal, I mean, almost everything is some combination of those food items, usually with vegetable oil. Another reason for the surge in consumption of vegetable oils is that there was an active campaign to get rid of the competition. So in the 1980s, and this is a really interesting story that I tell in my book, but there was a campaign by the American Soybean Association, whose main product was not only soybeans, but soybean oil. They wanted to get rid of the competition, which was palm oil. And that came from Malaysia and Indonesia. And palm oil, although it says oil, is actually a solid. So it's a very useful kind of fat because it doesn't go rancid. It's not oily. And so they ran a campaign where it was basically a sort of racist campaign where they put out ads saying that don't go buying your oils from those shady Asians, and they also lobbied the U.S. government to pass legislation or regulations preventing tropical oils from being used, and this was all run by the American Soybean Association. Steve Drake told me all about it. And he was proud of their success. This campaign against tropical oils really continues to this day, which is the American Heart Association, who is still supported, last time I checked, by Procter and Gamble and other major food corporations that depend on soybean oil. They made a point in their sort of presidential advisory that came out a few years ago on saturated fats, that they had a special section just demonizing coconut oil because they were afraid of that competition. Coconut oil had been sort of rising up and had become quite popular as an alternative cooking oil, and they made a special effort, just as the American Soybean Association had, to get rid of the competition by saying it was especially unhealthy. If you look at the American Heart Association, you can see that they are supported by soybeans here. What is it? Liberty Link. Every Liberty Link soybean seed sold for the 2017 will contribute 5 cents to the American Heart Association's Healthy for Good Food movement. So there are all kinds of links here. I'm not saying this has motivated that entire policy, but the American Heart Association continues to get about a third of its stated income from corporations. Another reason that we abandoned saturated fats for ever more vegetable oils was that there was this campaign also in the 1980s by a Nebraska millionaire who had had heart disease, had recovered from a heart attack, and thought that tropical oils were the bogeyman. He took out a number of full-page ads in newspapers all over America, and he terrified food companies. I interviewed food company executives who remember how scary this was. They were getting thousands of calls and letters from consumers saying, we want tropical oils out of our products. And so in response to these advertisements, companies like Nabisco, Kraft, other big companies got rid of tropical oils. And again, it was mainly palm oil that they removed from their products and replaced it with partially hydrogenated seed or bean oil. Okay, another reason was that we eat more and more vegetable oils is that Center for Science and the Public Interest, which is is a group that is good on some issues, but on others, they're very conventional. They were really anti-saturated fats. They still are, and they launched a campaign saying it was better to have partially hydrogenated vegetable oils than it was to eat saturated fats. And they are extremely influential in Washington. They've been around since the 1970s. They remain extremely influential. And this is what they were doing in the late 1980s. So one of the real turnabouts in the history of food in the 20th century was that there was this real oops moment when this food that everybody had been encouraged to eat for health, for, definitely better than saturated fats, whoops, it turns out that it contained, as a byproduct of the hydrogenation process, it contained trans fats. Well, turns out that trans fats were associated with increased risk of heart disease. And these are two of the early pioneers who came out with some of the evidence on that. And when they were coming out with their alarms about trans fats, this was maybe the late 1970s, they were largely poo-pooed and really mocked and harassed by most scientists in the field. But eventually they were proven right. And the FDA labeled trans fats, and now trans fats are out of the food supply. So really, partially hydrogenated oils have been removed from the American food supply. What replaces them is, of course, a big question, because remember, this basic vegetable oil molecule is unstable. It's slippery. It's not good in foods. You don't want oils leaking out of food. It goes rancid. Even at room temperature, will go rancid. So there is still this need for stability in what in the food industry is called functionality of your fats. And so the food industry developed a number of replacements. They tried genetically modified soybeans. Those were too expensive, but that was an experiment for a while. They moved over to more and more sunflower oil because that contains more of the fatty acids that have only one double bond and therefore are more stable. They did something called interesterified oils, which also turned out to be too expensive, really, for most uses. And so one of the solutions that they came up with, which was really just to kind of quietly return to using more tropical oils. These colorful kind of pods that you see here are from the palm. Those are palm oil pods. They're huge. I mean, it's really fascinating, and they grow on certain trees, mainly in Indonesia and Malaysia. And then coconuts, that's also mostly saturated. These are mostly saturated fatty acids. Remember, all foods contain a mixture of fatty acids, and so they're called oils, but they contain mostly saturated fatty acids, and that's what allows them to be a solid, stable fat at room temperature. What's the problem with that? Well, forests in Indonesia and Malaysia are being decimated. These are natural rainforests or other kinds of forests that are being decimated to plant palm trees and are destroying the habitat, particularly for orangutans, but for many different species of wildlife. And so there's a real concern about using too much of these fats. Plus, the American Heart Association doesn't like them. So, and there's a problem going back to having more saturated fat because the dietary guidelines, as we talked about, they still have a limit on saturated fat. It's supposed to be only 10% of calories, and that's a pretty low limit when you're talking about, the fact that saturated fat is in many of the natural foods that many people eat. They're particularly high in dairy and red meat, but they're really in every food except for sugar. And then I want to shift a little bit and talk about the problem of heated oils, because really when you got rid of hydrogenation is what gave oils that stability, right? Because they weren't as easily oxidizable. But now that, especially in restaurants, they cannot use hydrogenated vegetable oils anymore. Many of them have gone back to just using regular old oils, which they pour into their fryers, which they use to make the vast majority of restaurants use for all of their cooking needs. They're cheap and you can reuse them. But what happens when you heat up oils is that you create toxic oxidation products. And there have been literally hundreds of them have been identified and measured. Some of them are known toxins such as aldehydes and acrylenes. They are degraded triglycerides. I think I have some information here on just a short introduction to the really terrifying effect that they have on human health, especially aldehydes, which are this highly unstable molecule. They can barely be studied. They have been studied very little, but what we do know about them is extremely scary, that they disturb, they interfere with your basic DNA and RNA functioning. There's extreme oxidative stress in your body. Remember, the reason we take anti-inflammatories and then we want antioxidants is because we don't want oxidation in our body. So here we have a substance causing extreme oxidation in our body. There's probably no amount of antioxidants you can take to counteract that. They're implicated in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, and they are a formal marker for cancer, which may explain the outcome of those clinical trials that we saw earlier. So acrolein is another known toxin that is produced by when you heat these oils. It causes gastrointestinal distress and can lead to septic shock. And I have actually personally known cases of septic shock that have happened directly after going and eating at a restaurant that uses a lot of fried food. So I'm not saying that's related, but it is worrisome to eat out. And it's more worrisome now that we don't have trans fats, because remember, those oils were hardened and stabilized, and that meant that they were less likely to create these inflammatory products. Now we just have regular oils with the same original problems of oxidation and degradation. There's a researcher at the University of Minnesota which has found that these oxidation products do indeed enter your body. When you eat these foods, they pass through the brain-blood barrier. And you can get a significant amount of them just by eating an average, fast food meal. So remember that McDonald's used to fry their French fries in tallow before they were scared out of using saturated fats by Center for Science of the Public Interest and those other groups in the 1980s. But it wouldn't be a bad idea to go back to using some of those traditional fats. They're definitely safer and better for health. So my takeaway lessons about vegetable oils: avoid unstable polyunsaturated seed, bean, vegetable, plant oils. They may lower your cholesterol, yes, but as we saw, they have no effect in the long term of reducing your risk of heart disease or death from cardiovascular disease or death from any cause. And as we saw, it's very possible that the cholesterol lowering effect or the oils themselves have an impact in increasing your risk of dying from cancer. For those times when you need to use an oil, such as a salad dressing or a cold sauce, use olive oil because, as I mentioned, only one double bond, less potential for oxidation. So that is the safest oil to use. Or there are some oils that are high in monounsaturated fats. Again, mono means one double bond. So those are the ones to choose. For cooking, use stable fats whenever possible. Stable means solid. Anything that's a solid is a stable fat and is less likely to oxidize or has no risk of oxidation. So ghee, coconut oil, tallow, lard, suet. I mean, those are all available now, and there are craft makers whom you can find online. Those are all safer than using vegetable oils for cooking, especially. And I hate to say this, but until things change, we have to avoid fried foods in restaurants, or in some cases, some people really can't go to restaurants, and after you get used to not eating vegetable oils, they are very sensitive to the response that they have from restaurant meals when things are cooked or even just sauteed in vegetable oils. So if you're really going to try to get vegetable oils out of your diet, I think it means eating out less, unfortunately. So those are my takeaway messages. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. So if you have any questions, please contact me on my website, NinaTeicholz.com, or I'm on social media, mainly on Twitter, @BigFatSurprise. Thanks so much.